All right. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good night, wherever you're listening from. Really excited to have my guest here, Stephen Gray, who I'm going to read his bio here in a moment. Uh, just wanted to share. Stephen, are you calling in from Vancouver? Okay, just to make sure. I wanted to just offer a brief land acknowledgement that we're recording this from the traditional unceded ancestral territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations peoples. It feels really important to do that in the spirit of truth and reconciliation. The podcast is called Reconcile, and that's partly inspired by this movement of reconciling many things that us humans need to address in this current age and time. I'm going to start by reading Stephen's bio here, and then we're going to get this ball rolling. All right. Stephen Gray has been traveling spiritual and sacred medicine pathways for close to 50 years. He is a writer, educator, podcaster, psychedelic conference organizer, speaker, and cannabis ceremony leader. Stephen is the author-editor of 3 books, including the popular Cannabis and Spirituality, An Explorer's Guide to an Ancient Plant Spirit Ally, and the recently released How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World, Visionary and Indigenous Voices Speak Out. This was released November 2022. As a brief interlude, I just wanted to show, in case people are going to be watching this, there's the 2 books.
Sweet.
Yeah, really sweet. Highly recommend it if you're keen, interested explorer. Excuse me. Okay. For the past 11 years, Stephen has been the creative director of the iconic Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver, BC, Canada. The website, if you're interested, spiritplantmedicine.com. Since 2020, Stephen has also been interviewing leading influencers in psychedelics and consciousness transformation for the StephenGray Vision YouTube channel and related audio podcast formats. When not otherwise occupied, Stephen plays and composes music and indulges his love of photography. He lives with his wife and their female cat, Henry, in Vancouver. Stephen, welcome. Would there be anything else you'd like to add to that little bio there?
No, well, actually, not the bio per se, but in case you don't ask anything about it, because it may not be central to the purpose of our conversation, just like to say that we will be having another Spirit Plant Medicine Conference next November, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Already have 4 or 5 amazing speakers for it, and as the world, you might say, becomes less and less stable and more confusing in a lot of ways, this is an important empowerment node. And I hope people listening or watching your podcast will consider participating with us next year. We get together in one room and go through a kind of a journey over the course of the weekend, as you know, John, since you were there this year. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a beautiful time. I was there the year before as well.
Yeah.
And for reference, I would say Stephen and I connected years ago at, I think it might have been sooner than that, but your first book release, or the Cannabis and
Mm-hmm.
Spirituality book release,
Mm.
that you hosted, was at the St.
Yeah.
James Church, and it was a beautiful experience. Included a cannabis ceremony, which I think would be wonderful to explore in this conversation with you a little bit more about different approaches to
Mm-hmm.
how we can engage in spirit plant medicines or entheogens or psychedelics. So maybe we can start with, if you care to share a little bit about what started this whole path for you. Where did it start? Where's the beginning?
Well, in a kind of a humorous way, I might say it started thousands of years ago,
Mm-hmm.
um, because I'm pretty convinced from multiple sources of evidence, deep psychonautic journeys, historic traditions like Tibetan Buddhism and so on, that we go through multiple incarnations as souls. And we hopefully learn some things in each incarnation that we carry on into the next one. So, assuming, in fact, that I've had many incarnations and I've for what it's worth, I'll never be able to prove this. Perhaps after I drop my body, I'll go, oh yeah, okay, now I can confirm that that these stories are true. But I've been told by various psychics and channelers over the years that I've been around spiritual and monastic environments a lot in the past. So it's an ongoing journey in that sense. As far as this life. Um, I don't know there's no one point where my journey in that sense started. I mean, it basically started, from when I was born, no doubt. Uh, but I was a sensitive kid. I was a shy kid, and I was bent toward, finding out what's going on behind the curtain, as it were, spiritually, so to speak, at an early age. And I didn't really come upon any of that kind of information until I was in my late teens, especially when I went to university. And then it just happened to dovetail that my particular age group. I'll confess my age. I'm in my 70s. Um, uh, I'm part of that generation that's sometimes pejoratively referred to as the baby boomer generation. But I was also identified with what we at the time called the counterculture, like counter to the mainstream culture. And a bunch of factors dovetailed all at the same time. Two in particular, which was an explosion of interest in spirituality in the late 1960s, in particular Asian spirituality, Hinduism, Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, things like that. And that dovetailed, chronologically speaking, with an explosion of interest in the psychedelics, including cannabis. And I was interested in both of those things. So that's where the journey really kind of, put the pedal to the metal, as it were, for me, was way back then.
Mm-hmm. Out
Yeah.
of curiosity, is there a one standout first introductory to the psychedelic experience for you that was pivotal in that?
Um, well, let me see. Okay, so as probably a number of people, or a fair number of people, are still doing these days, I did not, for the most part, meet psychedelics with careful attention to set and setting. It was just kind of, loosey goosey that way. And frankly, I took, it was mainly LSD in those days was what was available, or as we called it, acid, right? And I did it in some really shitty situations, to be honest. But I also came upon a book called sorry, frog in the throat. I also came upon a book called The Lazy Man's Guide to Enlightenment, which was a lovely little book. I still have it in my shelf behind me here. And his learning, what he learned and wrote about, was primarily through his experiences with acid, with LSD. And he pointed out, well, basically what he said was, I mean, on one aspect of what he said, which stuck with me, was, regardless of whether it's in an intense trip or not, although it would tend to be exacerbated or heightened with a psychedelic trip, if you get into sort of quote unquote trouble, just remember this. This was at the very end of the book. He said, if you forget everything else in this book, just remember this: no resistance. So I did have an experience one night sitting alone in a cabin with LSD. Not necessarily recommended these days in terms of guidance and protection and so on, but it was fine in that way. And I basically died. I cried diamonds, a pile of diamonds piled up around me. I saw God and my girlfriend, with whom I was having a fight at the time. She wasn't staying with me right then; she was elsewhere. And so, I've had some pretty powerful experiences with all that. If anyone from that period of time stood out, it would have been that one. And but what really, I'll just give you a little bit more of my sort of biographical history for your audience. There was an idea around at that time, and now we're talking sort of early to mid 1970s, which was that if you may have had an amazing experience on a psychedelic. May have felt like you connected to the divine source, became one with all, or saw God, or whatever that was. But then what are you going to do? You can't necessarily hang out in that state. You can't be taking acid every day or every week or whatever for the rest of your life. So what are you going to do with that information? Nowadays we call it integration, of course, right? Um, so the kind of the meme or the idea that came out of that for a lot of us was, well, you need some kind of ongoing connection, some kind of ongoing practice. Meditation, yoga, and perhaps meditation in particular. So that, for me, became Tibetan Buddhism. And when I talked about perhaps having a previous incarnational history, uh, I would like to think I won't take the time to explain why, but I have a fairly strong intuition that I've been connected to that particular world and worldview before, and in particular the teacher that I connected with, Chogyam Trungpa, a Tibetan master, who I still consider to this day the most influential person in my life, even though he's been gone on the material level for close to 40 years now. Anyway, so that became my practice for quite a long time, and they weren't interested in the psychedelics particularly, that community, so I dropped them. But it was Terence McKenna that reconnected me when I started coming upon his work in the late 1980s, and he reconnected. I was always interested in the spiritual potential of psychedelics, but it didn't, as I say, seem particularly useful at some point, or dovetailing with the work that I was doing, the practice and so on with Tibetan Buddhism. But Terence pointed out that for thousands of years, indigenous peoples from many parts of the world had been using these substances in a spiritual way, in a sacred way, in a reverential way. And that kind of, turned a light bulb on in my mind. Aha, and that basically led to where I am today and what I've been doing since.
Hmm. Can you say a little more about what lit the light bulb, or about that light bulb? Could you stretch it a little bit further?
Well, not too much more to say about that, actually. Just that, Terence had spent a bunch of time in South America with indigenous people who used ayahuasca in particular for spiritual and healing purposes. So for me, it was connecting the spiritual path, which I'd been working with Buddhism for, by then a couple of decades almost,
Mhm.
with the potential of psychedelics for participating in that awakening process, rather than just sort of casual use or solo use or whatever. Although Terence himself did advocate, as with psilocybin, he suggested that people do them. He said, "Sit down, shut up, and pay attention in silent darkness."
Yeah.
Not necessarily the best advice for a lot of people, frankly, but nonetheless, I started looking for connection. Like I did do some psilocybin on my own in the 90s with varying degrees of fruition, so to speak. But I did ayahuasca a little bit back then, but my first really big connection with a community was through the Native American church, peyote prayer ceremonies. And for 12 years, I went down to Washington State and participated in perhaps 30 or so of these all-night teepee ceremonies, and those were amazing. Those people ran and run an impeccable container, basically, for doing this work. And then more recently, well, not since the pandemic kicked in, but up until then, for about 5 years, I had been participating in perhaps a couple of dozen or more of the Santo Daime works, they call them. And the Santo Daime are a syncretic um, religion sourced in Brazil originally that uses, excuse me, ayahuasca as their sacrament. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Wow. There's so much I could and want to explore
Uh,
further in that with you. The part that I was charting along the way there that is standing out. Well, I definitely want to revisit integration, what that
sure.
means, how important that is, what that looks like. Um, but the interesting biographical nexus point or development in your life where spirituality met with spirit plant medicines or entheogens and psychedelics, there was something there for you that you recognized is important, an
Hmm.
important relationship there. Maybe I'm just reflecting that, but it seems like that was an important thing that not everybody does. You know, some people are in like one camp or the other, but there's an integration there too for you. And I guess you spoke to it a little bit there with Terence McKenna speaking to
Yeah.
time in the Amazon and you know, maybe I'll share this. Something that I really appreciate about you and what you've done, you know, with this book, How Psychedelics Can Help Change the World, Save the World, and your previous book, is you bring together many voices. The
Hmm.
subtitle of How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World is Visionary and Indigenous Voices Speak Out. And even at your Spirit Plant Medicine conference, it's really um, beautiful, refreshing, astonishing to see the diversity of voices that you bring together. I see that as a
Hmm.
real gift to the world. Um, and so, yeah, where to go with that? I'm touched by that, just to say that. And it seems like a really important, um, there's a lot of value in that, in bringing together all these voices. And I guess where I'm going with that, Terence McKenna, his time in the Amazon, and then the bridge you made there, this connection with a different kind of use of psychedelics uh, for spiritual use, for healing, that's been actually going on for thousands of years. Um, so we could maybe go down the line of exploring or talking a little bit about shamanism or maybe rites of passage and it being initiated into something. I wonder if we could explore that a little bit.
Hmm.
So if psychedelics seen as a or entheogens are a form of a rite of passage or an initiation rites, what are they what are they initiating?
Well, there's lots of different ways to talk about that, John. One example might be the Bwiti religion of primarily in Gabon in Western Equatorial Africa. It's spelled Bwiti. Um, uh, Iboga, sometimes pronounced Iboga, but I think properly pronounced Iboga, spelled Iboga, is a shrub that grows. It's whose natural habitat is that area in Africa,
Mhm.
and they scrape the bark of the root of that plant for the medicine. It is always interesting how they find, how do you find that, right? How did they discover that? No one will ever know. But there are, as of last time I heard, over 3 million adherents to that religion, primarily in Gabon. It's legal in Gabon as well,
Mhm.
and they use it as an initiation rite primarily, from the one or two books I've read on it anyway. Um, there's a book called something like, I forget the title of it. The subtitle was "The Visionary Root of Africa" or something like that. On Iboga, and so that their tradition is was and probably still is, I think, um, that they would use a massive, really active dose of Iboga as an initiation. As part of an initiation rite and ceremony in their culture. So, and in this one book that I just mentioned, there would be like weeks of preparation for the initiate, who would be an adolescent, I believe. I'm not sure what age would be the exact appropriate age. And then they would have the encounter with the medicine itself, and that particular medicine lasts a long time, can last 24 hours or more. Just for people who are not familiar with it, by the way, there's a psychoactive alkaloid called ibogaine, which is used in clinics for primarily for addiction treatment, and that's another aspect of its work. But for the traditional, just the root itself, they would have this work or whatever ceremony that would go on for, I don't know, a day or so, or two, maybe, I don't know. And then there would be follow-up activities and all that kind of thing. And what they say apparently is that they are introducing that person to the culture of what they call real people, authentic people. And this is actually a common theme, not necessarily related to psychedelics, but with indigenous people that I've read different things on indigenous people from different parts of the world and their kind of cosmology or whatever. And they often will say, we are the real people, we are the authentic people. There's Wade Davis talks about this people, the Koji, I think they're called, who live up in the mountains in, I believe it's Ecuador. If someone's an anthropological scholar, they might correct me on that. Nonetheless, they consider themselves the elder brothers. This is according to Wade Davis in one of his books, anyway. The elder brothers of the whole world. And they say that it's their prayers that are keeping things together for us wayward younger brothers around the planet.
Wow.
And they have an initiation. They have, it's not for everybody. The Iboga, the Bwiti people, would initiate lots of different people into their culture, into their cosmology or whatever. The Koji, they identify particular individuals, and it would be a rare individual, very few of these, as I understand. And that person, and again, and this is all in the way Wade describes it, so I haven't looked into it beyond that. So we're taking Wade's word for it, although he's a pretty reliable source. It's actually one of the world's leading anthropologists, in my view. Nonetheless, he describes how this person, this initiate, would be put in an underground bunker of some kind for the first 18 years of his life, and receive teachings and different things like that, but never see the outside world until the age of 18. And then at the age of 18, they bring him out into the world to see the sun for the first time. And somehow that, tends to produce quite a mystical person. So there's lots of different ways to do that. In our culture, I wouldn't necessarily say that initiation per se is part of the process with psychedelics. It doesn't have to be related to that at all, really. It's really like psychedelics are ideally they make brain connections that connect us to the parts of our brain that we've shut down, you might say. That's how I see them, as they're often referred to as non-specific amplifiers. They amplify what's already there. It's not like creating some new thing that didn't have potential existence already, right? It's that these psychedelics are very simpatico with brain chemistry. They're non-toxic for the most part. Some of the semi-synthetic and synthetic ones can be more toxic, but certainly psilocybin mushrooms, peyote, ayahuasca, although of course people are going, well, wait a minute, ayahuasca makes you throw up. Well, yes, it does oftentimes, but that's because they consider it purging. They consider it part of the healing process. Psilocybin will make a few people feel nauseous, but it's not because it's toxic. It's not. In other words, these things are simpatico with us and our bodies and our brains. And really what I think they're doing, this is kind of what you might call quasi-science or pseudoscience, but I think what they're really doing is they're opening up channels in our brain that are already there and existing, and helping us reconnect to our true nature in that way. And also, as they do that, they are opening up other ways that we have buried information, you might say, like, for example, memories of childhood abuse or wounds of one kind or another. Basically, we're all wounded to one degree or another, and psychedelics, in the right kinds of circumstances, can shine some light on those those issues that we still haven't resolved and help us bring them up, see them, and release them, which in that context is certainly an argument for doing them in a carefully controlled setting, whether it be ceremony situation with a well-trained, experienced ethical guide, or whether it be with a trained psychedelic sitter or guide or therapist. Certainly, people can do these things on their own. Some people, I mean, lots of people, but to really get the most benefit out of them therapeutically, you might say, I think it's probably a good idea for most people to try to connect with some kind of involvement for getting protection and help with working with them.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
This part, maybe we're definitely got to get into this piece around integration for sure, but I wanted to share a little something that Terence McKenna said that I'll never forget, and maybe it's a nice bridge here, which was he was talking about his observation that it seems as though an adolescent level of consciousness is running the world right now. And he used this term called neoteny, which he expressed or shared as the retention of juvenile traits into
Hmm.
adulthood. And
Yeah.
that really stuck with me. And since hearing that and um, working with people and hearing folks share in integration about their experiences in psychedelics and theogenic experiences, um, it's really had me thinking about both individual and collective transformation from more adolescent, or to say less mature, ways of seeing and being into more,
Hmm.
I don't know, so call it adulthood or wise or more responsible and mature ways of being. And I guess I'm curious how, I'm going to use the word in this moment, entheogens can be supportive of that growth. And I just want to offer one thing from one quote, which was from How Psychedelics Can Help Save the World. One of your contributors, Belinda Ariacho, beautiful speaker, which was this idea of inner standing. A little bit of a play on words from like understanding to inner standing, and I think her chapter had something to do with turning the soil.
The
So I just want
turning of
to
the soil.
turning of the soil, yeah. So I just wanted to
Yeah.
offer her voice in there to complement maybe if you have any thoughts on what Terence McKenna had to say and or what you see in individuals and collectively is happening with
Yeah.
that process.
Well, that's a really big and complex question, to be honest. And, I could try to come at it from a variety of different ways. First of all, I agree with Terence. There's different ways to talk about it. Another way to talk about that adolescence, so to speak, is what you might also describe as a spiritual disconnection. We don't almost universally know who we are.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'll put a little caveat or disclaimer on it here. I won't claim to be enlightened, but I have practiced and studied for a very long time, and I at least have glimpses and intuitions about, what seems to be the true nature of who we are as human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And that is that we are connected to the source ultimately. That is our birthright, our ultimate potential, is that we are connected to whatever you want to call that. And you don't have to get hung up on language. Some people could call it God, some people could call it creator, some people could call it the Holy Spirit, some people could call it something like divine source consciousness or the field of all eternal love and wisdom, or whatever it is. There does seem to be an eternal source of intelligence and creation that we have become separated from, almost all of us. This is what the mystics have been trying to tell us for a few thousand years, is that there have been these rare individuals who have in a sense broken through the veil that we've built around ourselves. And then they say, hey folks, this is what's real, right? This is why these indigenous people use the term real people oftentimes, because real people, so to speak, know who they are, know what they're connected to, know that we are embedded in the world, that we're intimately interwoven and interdependent with everything and not above it, which is kind of the great illusion or delusion that that Western society and modern societies have put onto themselves and each other, that humanity is in a sense this superior species that gets to rule the world. Well, it's brought us to the brink of disaster and collapse, frankly. So why psychedelics can help with that is what I was saying earlier. They can open up channels in the brain, as it were, that potentially, again, potentially in quotes is really important. It's not a given by any stretch. And again, circumstances and intention, skill, et cetera, have a lot to do with it, but they can potentially open us up to the real that we have buried, and that our cultures have contributed to, significantly or dramatically in keeping us buried. As my old Buddhist teacher called it, mutual group imprisonment. Nobody wants, in a sense, at the core level, that it's an unconscious motivation for most people. I think nobody wants other people to wake up, because then those people become a mirror. If I have authentic presence, then people may not know how to relate to me. Some people may not. They have to open up to that, or they have to turn away or reject, or in some cases actively fight against that, right? There's a famous, I know it's not famous, it's a favorite little uh, fable, I guess you could say, that I came upon once. I think it maybe comes from the Sufi tradition or the Middle East, but in any case, it's this little fable of a frog who lives in a well, and he's never been out of the well. He just lives at the bottom of this well, and there's maybe insects to eat, and there's some water and rocks and moss and Lord knows what down there, but he's never been out of it. There's this light at this hole at the top of the well, and the sky's up there, but he doesn't know what that is. It's just this sort of part of his life, right? One day, another frog falls into the well accidentally and explains to this first frog, the dweller, that there's a whole vast world out there. The dweller of the well, upon hearing that, kills the intruder. In other words, does not want to know about this. We want to remain in our safe place. So that's what Buddhists would call ego. And ego, by the way, is really important to be clear about what that is, because there's a lot of, I would say, partial confusion about the nature of ego and how to deal with, quote, ego. So first of all, there's egotism, which is like another order of ego in a sense, right? Like an egotistical, arrogant, superior-minded, maybe quite irritating person, like Donald Trump, for example, has a massive ego, and many people do. But on the purely spiritual, psychological level, ego is the way that we identify ourselves in the world. We create what Buddhist teachings would call an illusionary, non-existent sense of self, a fiction, and it's put together by all the concepts, beliefs, and stories that we put together from the time we're born. And again, we've been perhaps forming in past lives as well. But and that, as again, I say, our culture contributes to in the sense of mutual group imprisonment. Nonetheless, we identify ourselves with this collection of stories, and we say, well, this is who I am or what I am, and this is what's real and what's not real, and true and not true, and all that kind of thing, right? And why I say it's important to kind of identify it and define it in a fairly clear way is that it's not necessarily it's not that we like sort of like pull out a gun and shoot ego, or like sort of aggressively try to banish the ego from ourselves, which would be impossible anyway. And in fact, that would be kind of a circular thing to do, because it would be ego doing that. There would be another aggressive move on the part of oneself to try to do something about that. It's more like observing the ways in which this ego, this sense of this creation of ideas that we have put together and call a self, has limited us, has cut us off from our true nature. So again, where the psychedelics can potentially come in is they can soften that as, or, just like loosen those boundaries temporarily. And that's the same thing that meditation hopefully could do as well. Perhaps I should just take a moment for those of your viewers or listeners that are not familiar with how that word can be used as well, if I may, because the word meditation, because people see that one in different ways as well.
Yeah.
And so I just want to say that there is something that I would call universal, pure, unconditioned meditation. And in a sense, it doesn't involve any practice at all. It's just simply the practice, if you will, of being present. But because the ego is so ruthless, so persistent, the ego is the part of us that's afraid of letting go of that identity that we've created for ourselves, right? And as I say, it's not about getting rid of it in a sense, and it has served us in a way, because like we come into this world, we're overwhelmed, we have no idea what's going on. We're so sensitive when we're wee ones, and so we have to find ways to cope. And so the personality, if you will, the ego, is the way that we do that, and most of us manage it more or less successfully, but it again becomes our prison as well. It becomes our, little room that we tuck ourselves into and try to remain safe within. So as we grow, we want to start hopefully looking at the ways that we have done that to ourselves, and again contributed to vociferously by our culture.
Yeah.
And where again the psychedelics come in, is they can soften
Mm.
those those boundaries, as it were, right?
Mm.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering any
Oh,
particular
this is
question with that.
this
I'm
is
just
really
kind of
rich.
rambling at the moment,
That's great. It's a
Yeah,
great ramble.
yeah,
You know, something about that. So psychedelics, plant medicines,
yeah.
can support a softening of the boundaries. Now,
Temporarily.
temporarily, right? So
Yeah,
there's so many directions I want to go in this with you. Let's plant this as a seed for now. But Huston Smith, religious scholar,
yeah,
um, theologian, talks about, and you've referenced this, the difference or the distinction between having a religious experience
yeah.
and living quote unquote religious lives. I want to also
Absolutely.
offer a nice compliment to that is Charles Tart, in his work on the chapter might even be, or the essay, moving from states to traits.
Yeah,
Temporary
Houston Smith said that one too.
did he?
You
Okay,
know,
maybe they're
yeah,
both.
I think so. Well, Charles Tart may have as well, but I know it from Smith. He said something to the effect of like, what's more important than altered states is altered traits,
Mm.
right? Yeah.
Mhm.
So that ties in with his comment about well, what he actually said more or less was, at least the way I remembered it and maybe quoted it somewhere, was that he said it's clear that psychedelics can produce a religious experience. It's much less clear they can produce a religious life.
Yeah.
Right. That's why I used the word temporarily in opening the doors, as Aldous Huxley put it, the doors of perception. They
Mm.
they do that, but then as you've alluded to a couple of times already, John, then it's what do you do after that, right? Which is where integration comes in, and
Yeah.
that's a whole
Well,
other topic, I guess.
I
Yeah,
think we're soon approaching that one, which
yeah,
you've touched hints at, like what that is or can
yeah,
be. I want to share, well, a few things actually, just as a nice compliment, it seems, which is even in our own backyard here in BC, for example, the topic of real people and our Indigenous brothers and sisters talking about this, and it's my understanding there's a crisis, mental health crisis hotline for Indigenous folks. It's called KUUS. My understanding is that in the Nuchalneth language, KUUS means real person. And there's a story that I learned from a fellow colleague of mine who works for the Ucluta First Nation, was the observation at the time of settlers showing up on boats. They were showing up all white, scurvy, skinny, and homeless, without a home. And there's a word for that too, which I'm forgetting in this moment. But I guess it just feels important to ground that idea. It's not an idea; it's an experience of being a real person, being at home.
hmm
on a land, in a place, but also in oneself. And so maybe
Yeah.
this is a little bit of a bridge, but I really like what you said about the mutual group imprisonment, like a mutual
Hmm.
sense of homelessness. And I think it
Hmm.
might have even been Tart or Smith who talked about the idea of consensus trance, also being in a consensus trance. This,
That's similar.
yeah, and you said
Yeah.
this kind of pervasive sense of spiritual disconnection that it seems like the
Yeah.
masses tend to be in. And so plant medicines, psychedelics may be supportive in opening up the channels, softening edges or boundaries temporarily, perhaps. I'm thinking of one of your contributors, Chris Beisch,
Yeah.
who I think in his book, Diamonds from Heaven, said something.
LSD in the mind of the universe.
Yeah. I remember
Yeah.
him saying his preference would be to have maintained Diamonds from Heaven if they would have stuck with that title. But
Yeah.
something that I feel is spoken about a little less in communities that are talking about psychedelics, um, which deserves, I think, some airtime, is what Chris Beisch said, that the greatest danger when it comes to having these experiences is psychological inflation. So I find that's an interesting idea that on the one hand, it can soften the ego, maybe
Yeah.
egolessness, but the greatest risk, as Chris Beisch says, is psychological inflation. And I think he offered a complement to that, that one of the supports in preventing that is integration and social community.
Hmm.
Curious as I offer that, if you have any thoughts on that, as you've probably interacted with Chris a few times, and that just seems like an interesting thing that can happen in the human experience, that there's this
Yeah.
inflation after.
Yeah. Well, I don't know how prevalent that is exactly. I mean, I couldn't say. I don't know if anyone's done a study on it per se,
Sure.
but yeah. Hang on a second. Sorry, I got a lot of phlegm this morning for some reason. Um, yeah. So these are just possible ways of talking about it. Just for people to consider, perhaps.
Mhm.
You might say that working with psychedelics is very advanced spiritual practice. It's like taking you from Kansas to the land of Oz in, you know, half an hour, right? Rather than a lifetime of meditating and so on and so on. So that has great potential because of the fact that we've buried the truth of who we are. So it opens us up to this fact that, oh, yes, there is another world that actually could be the real world, the spiritual world, the enspirited world. Um, so they have that great potential. However, and I'm not sure if I can do this complete justice, but I'll do my best. Um, because they are sort of like going from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds kind of idea, you didn't you didn't necessarily do the grounding,
Mm,
humbling work that would, it's like the difference between walking from A to B and taking a jet plane from A to B. You're
yeah.
not seeing the landscape on the way there, right? So that's not necessarily a problem. But if, for example, you have needs for control, power, ambition, if you had like a kind of what Buddhists might call a poverty mentality, before that, like low self-esteem, intense needs for approval, and all that kind of thing,
Mm,
then you have these potential insights, and then you can feel like you're special, right? So there's two terms that are related terms for that. One is spiritual materialism, and one is spiritual bypassing. I know you know the terms, John. So my old Buddhist teacher, Tugim Trungpa, has a book actually called Cutting Through Spiritual
yeah.
Materialism. And in that book, he says that spiritual materialism is actually the most dangerous or the worst kind of materialism. And the way I would describe that, I haven't actually looked at the book for 20 or 30 years, but to the best of my recollection and understanding, the way that I would describe that, why that is the case, is because if you're materialistic about material things or wealth, it's not as easy to make a glorified case for that as it is to make the case for spiritual, you know, wisdom and all that kind of stuff. So you can say, oh yes, well I've seen God and all that, and so on and so on. And so it's really easy to make the case that you've had some amazing experience. As I say, it's a little harder to do that if it's just about getting super rich or something, right? So it's dangerous that way, and especially because other people are vulnerable. We're all confused and lost on some level, and so people tend to be looking for guidance, for new information, for people who seem to have answers, and so on. And if you come across as somebody who has answers, then you'll if you can do it reasonably well, if you can articulate it, you're good chance you might seduce or hook a certain number of people into uh, putting you on that pedestal in a sense, right? That, oh, wise one or something like that. So I think it's kind of, that's where the danger comes in that way. And it's related to spiritual bypassing, because what spiritual bypassing is almost universal, I would say. It not necessarily confined by any stretch to working with psychedelics or spiritual work altogether. It's actually the best way I can try to explain it is that hardly anybody wants to look at the dark side or the underbelly or the seven deadly sins, if you want to put it in those terms, within us, our own potential to have what we might call negative feelings, attitudes, and so on. Most people don't want to deal with that side of ourselves. Most people want to see ourselves as, okay and good and decent and all that kind of thing. So spiritual bypassing is just like not wanting to look at that stuff. And it's maybe more pernicious or dangerous in the psychedelic realm or any kind of spiritual work, because if you have, especially again, insights that you've had experiences where you feel the presence of universal love or whatever, right? And you think, oh yes, I'm connected to that somehow. Then you're not looking at, and you don't want to look at these, little thorns, as it were, right? The sides of yourself that might be greedy for power or money or sex or anything like that, that might be like an envious person, or have streaks of jealousy or bitterness or anger or fear, all of that stuff. That's all stuff that we tend to want to push aside. And so that's spiritual bypassing, and that's part of that. Again, since we're talking about, I mean, it's not again relegated to just psychedelics, but certainly since that's what we're talking about, it's a danger with the use of psychedelics, is that you can think that you are wiser than you actually are if you don't look at that material. And that material, by the way, is humbling. We don't want to think of ourselves as having these petty sides of ourselves, you might say, but in acknowledging them non-judgmentally, not beating yourself over the head because, oh, I'm smaller minded than I would have wanted to imagine myself to be. But if you just acknowledge that you have these, whatever they are, all those things I mentioned, right? Petty jealousies or anything, competitiveness, all these things, just by acknowledging those non-judgmentally, that's humbling. And that's very, very valuable, I would say. And I'm speaking from experience, that I've found myself humbled by acknowledging non-judgmentally some of these thorny sides of my being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm curious on that note because I think this is the kind of message that many people need to hear is
Mm-hmm.
like in an integrated way how or what has been instructed or taught to us or taught to you, how it comes through, what effect it has on us on our in our day to day. That maybe it's not just a temporary state, but
Yeah.
a continued process of unfolding and living this value of, say, humility. So I guess my question then is, in your experience then, do you find that plant medicines, entheogen psychedelics have a great potential to teach us how to be humble or to be okay with our humanness, which is to say the dark sides and the light sides, or any thoughts on that?
Well, again, they can give you the insights, but then it's what you do with it. You have to know how to deal with that, right? I'll give you an example in my own personal life. Um, this was in the context of a Santo Daime works, they call them a work. That's their word for a ceremony.
Okay.
And so, deep in the medicine space, in the middle of one of these 7 hour events, just this word came up into my consciousness, just one word, all by itself, out of the blue. I hadn't been having any thoughts about anything for a while, just being in the space of the medicine. And all of a sudden, poof, this word, pride. It wasn't like a sentence that said, Stephen, you should look at the potential that you have some pride. It
Sure.
was just pride. And I immediately got it, that it was for me. And my first reaction, I don't remember if it was so much a reaction like right at that moment. I certainly just remembered it. It might have been in kind of, post ceremony reflection or something. I remember thinking to myself, this was, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago. Uh, Pride, really, huh? Okay, so I associate pride with a kind of an attitude of superiority and, nose up in the air, sort of, potentially arrogant, know it all, all that kind of stuff. And I
Mm.
thought, well, I'm not really like that. So what is this? Then when I started to think about it more, I realized that pride is almost ubiquitous and it's very subtle oftentimes. Um, Pride is, in a sense, the way that we hold ourselves back from life to some degree or another.
Mm.
So anything that makes us feel better than anybody, like if we, like, I don't know, sorry to pick on Donald Trump, everyone else is picking on him, so I might as well join in. But he would be a good example of somebody that you might feel superior to. Like, what a what an asshole, right? What a horrid person this is. And if you have that view, but it makes you feel better because, oh, I'm not like that. That's pride. That's also this spiritual bypassing stuff that I mentioned earlier, right? Like, oh no, I couldn't possibly have the kind of duplicitous, self-serving, narcissistic parts of myself. No, that I'll put that all on him. That's called projection. Um,
Mm.
so, excuse me. Uh, Sorry, Donald Trump's name threw me off completely. I forgot where I was going with that one. Uh, Refresh me, and I'll get back on it.
Sharing a little bit about um, being in the work, this word pride
Oh yeah,
showing.
right. So this word came up, pride,
Hmm.
and so the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it's very subtle, and any sense of feeling like you're superior or even fear has to do with pride, right? Because fear is protecting yourself. Like it has to do with control, like trying to control circumstances or control your own responses to life or whatever. That's all kind of tied in with pride. So basically, yeah, coming back to your question, um, what the psychedelics potentially do is give you the insights, but then the integration, as it were, is, one way of thinking about it. Like, even if you're taking, let's say you're taking ayahuasca once a month or something like that, right? Maybe it's 5 hours. So that's 5 hours out of one day. That's 20% of one day, right? So what percent of that is that of a month, right? Like 150th of a month or something ridiculous, right? A tiny percentage of portion of your time was spent in that ceremony. So that means the other like 99% of your time, you're not in that space. So that's where the real work is, right? And that's that's just one step at a time. And you might even say that ultimately the psychedelics, eventually, I can't say where that would when that would happen, or even authoritatively if it needs to happen with any particular individual, but you might speculate that at a certain point you might be able to leave the psychedelics behind, maybe after several years or whatever, because at some point, it's just the work that you do every second of every day of being present, and allowing yourself to see your mind. And it's not navel gazing to do that. The navel gazing part would be if you're constantly in your head worrying about yourself and thinking about yourself, how am I doing? And, this isn't working well for me or whatever, that's more like a navel gazing kind of a thing. But the, in a sense, universal practice, like I mentioned earlier in the conversation, what meditation is, ultimately, or in the purest form, is it's simply being present. But because it's so difficult to do that, teachers would give us some simple techniques like gently pay attention to the breath, acknowledge when you've gone off in your head, and come back to the present, right? So that practice right there is actually the practice that we could and perhaps should be doing if we have any intention of waking up and healing moment by moment through our lives. And it, again, I want to say that it doesn't take you away. To do that does not take you away from being present in the world, again, because it's not like you're thinking about it, but you're just being aware. Eckhart Tolle talked about that a little bit. He said, you don't have to be sitting down to meditate. Not that he was discouraging, sit down meditation, but you don't have to be sitting down because you can do it pretty much anywhere. You are standing there having a conversation with somebody at your workplace, and you might notice, oh, I'm not in my body. I'm holding my shoulders up. I'm not allowing my breath to come in. I'm not feeling grounded. So you could just let yourself breathe, pay attention, be grounded on the earth, and go, oh, yes, I was creating some tension in my mind. Did I have to do that? Maybe not, right? So that's the practice. That's the most important. That's the essential practice, is moment by moment through life. This is as I see it anyway, and certainly confirmed by many great spiritual teachings, is that, we just observe our minds non-judgmentally, not, as I say, analyze it to death or any of that kind of thing, but just note how, what state of mind am I in, and what's going on around me in this exact moment, right? And then this is where the integration, as opposed to spiritual bypassing, comes in, right? Because you're, and the humbling that can come from that, because like, oh yeah, I'm feeling a little, this or that, and so, no, I'm not going to beat myself over the head with it. I'm just going to observe it. And the teachings that come from the great teachers about that is that when you do that, when you just see the contents of what comes up in your mind, over and over, perhaps over years and years, then what tends to happen is whatever power those thoughts had over you, that drove your behavior on an unconscious or barely conscious level, tends to dissipate, tends to dissolve, right? So again, in terms of your kind of inquiries about this, the psychedelics can open those channels, they can provoke insights, etc. But it's then, what do you do with that? So then you just, like using the example of pride, for example, right? It's like, okay, so, oh, here's a moment where I noticed that I have a little bit of that kind of pride, where I'm feeling like a little special or a little self-important or something like that. It's like, okay, so I'm not an enlightened being. Oh, rats. But that's really good for me to see that, I have these things, these different aspects of myself that are perhaps standing in the way of being that quote unquote enlightened person or whatever, right?
Yeah, I'm hearing in that there's a few things that seem to be conditions for that, seemingly. One would be self-awareness. Like you need to have become aware that that's a thing that you do, or
Mm-hmm.
a way of functioning from this prideful place has an
Exactly.
influence on me and
Yep.
potentially the world around me, but it influences me in a way where maybe I'm picking up on a thread here where the integration comes in more, is whether the spiritual teachings or just lived experience are showing you, oh, like I don't need to hold on to that. I can let go. I can soften. I wonder
Mm-hmm.
if for you, when you say observe it non-judgmentally, is there a quality of letting go in that? or a form of surrender or non-attachment, I guess, something like that.
There's certainly a degree of surrender to that, uh, or just and self-honesty. And I think I mentioned earlier that it does take courage, um,
Mm,
because we want to see ourselves. There's an old Sufi teaching or saying that you're not as good a person as you think you are, right? We all want to justify ourselves. My Buddhist teacher once said, "Stop justifying yourself and just live." Right? Um,
mm,
that's ego. That's the part of this ourselves that's always trying to shore up this kind of fragile cocoon that we've built around ourselves. Um, but it's our limitation as well, right? So it's just a matter of, I would say, I mean, lots of people have ideas, and many people have good ideas about integration, and there can be other ways to integrate these experiences. Can be in community. For example, there's a group here in Vancouver called Flying Sage, which holds weekly integration sessions for psychedelic users and so on. I don't know you have to have taken a psychedelic, but I think that's primarily what they're for people that have been doing psychedelic journeying, and then they can come to these circles and you can talk about it, and then that can be extremely helpful. I
yeah.
would say the ultimate integration is what I've been talking about, which is that you just pay attention to the insights and watch how they manifest in your life, right?
Mm,
And just try to be as simple as possible. Uh, they, the we, well, maybe I should just say this a little bit about the thinking mind, actually. This is basic central Buddhist teaching, but I think it's a universal understanding amongst any person or community that really understands how the ego creates these limitations and obstacles and blindness. Um, and this is the way the Chögyam Trungpa talked about it in particular, was that the thinking mind, or what is sometimes called the discursive mind, while of course having its uses. I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation if we weren't using our thinking minds, right? So it obviously has is essential to be able to think. However, where it gets really tricky, and we often don't even realize it, is that the thoughts are also the way that we create an ink cloud or an obscuration to our true nature as connected, spiritually, that way, to the divine, or whatever you want to call it. So we just throw up this kind of ink cloud of overlapping thinking, and it creates a block or an obscuration or a fog of some kind, that we think protects us, but doesn't actually protect us very well, because we always have to maintain it. So people often will say, "Oh, I can't stop thinking, I kind of think obsessively." Well, that's why, and again, no judgment. This is what we did to survive, right? To cope in the world. So let's not judge and say, "Oh, well, there's nothing I can do about that. That's just my nature. That's who I am. I think a lot," right? You don't, that's not your ultimate nature necessarily. Your thinking mind, and this is what Eckhart Tolle says, it's a tool, and the ideal, as this is Eckhart Tolle, he says, he's the guy that, if people don't know, that wrote The Power of Now. Anyway, he said the relationship you want to have with your thinking mind is that it's a tool that you can pick up when you need to use it, but you're capable of putting it down when you don't need it, right? So this is where the integration, moment by moment observation comes in. Oh, there I'm just thinking again. I could be thinking about anything. It's not that it's a great thought or a terrible thought. It's not, the content of the thought is irrelevant to that process. The mere fact that we're thinking all the time is what creates this obscuration, right? So then you just observe that. And for a lot of people, sitting down to meditate is helpful, especially if they do that simple practice of paying gentle attention to the breath, observing thoughts and letting them go and coming back to it, because that's how you start to see that, oh yes, you actually were going off, or being off all the time. And maybe you weren't connected to your body fully either, right? Maybe you weren't, because you're in your head, maybe you're not aware of what your feet are doing, or that you're not breathing that well, or you're holding tension in your jaw, your shoulders, or your chest, or whatever, right? So it's that sense of ongoing, what Buddhists call mindfulness awareness, that is the ultimate practice in a sense, and the ultimate uh, practice of integration. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm hearing, well, I really appreciate how you're integrating and speaking to the importance of a personal, individualized practice that for you has sounds to be personal and individualized and has had some cultural influence from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition to practice such a uh, thing as mindfulness awareness practice, right? More I could and would love to say and dive into there with you on, but I'm hearing generally a theme of a progressive practice. The ultimate integration tool is this. Uh, I don't know if this language resonates, but just not attaching or disidentifying or making a distinction between your thinking mind as a function, a thing that is a tool for you, like you said, to pick it up
Hmm.
when you need it. But this what seems more rare is this capacity or ability to put it down.
Yeah, it is rare
Yeah.
because of the persistence and perniciousness of this ego.
Yes.
So you
Okay.
could think of the ego as this voice within you
Okay.
that is afraid of non-existence, of its own non-existence, right? It's the voice within us that is always trying to protect us, right? But it ultimately doesn't really work because it requires constant maintenance in a sense, constant struggle in that way.
Definitely want to touch in on something here about um, well, two things. I think it's going to connect, but what I'm hearing from you, in essence, you mentioned courage, honesty,
Hmm.
surrender, non-judgment, being humbled, humility. I'm hearing
Yeah.
some really rich, potentially virtuous values that are um, potentially awakened, potentially in a psychedelic experience or a spiritual practice. There's something that seems really integrative there. But what I want to bridge here is something I've heard you share numerous times before, an invitation, which sounds really wise to me. And I'd love to hear if you care to share more, which is stay behind the medicine.
Hmm.
Can
Yeah.
you share a
Yeah,
little?
that could easily be linked to what we've been talking about here, what I've been talking about.
Yeah,
So it's a metaphor and it's literal or actual.
right.
And the first place I heard it was in a Native American church peyote prayer ceremony, where the roadman, the man who was conducting the meeting, leading the meeting, said that to us one morning to the group. You know, his relatives just want to say, remember this: stay behind the medicine. So the medicine is both the actual medicine, in this case the peyote, but it's also a metaphor, I guess you could say, or I'm not sure if metaphor is the correct word or if it's analogy, but for um, the voice of the real, so to speak, the non-egoic voice of truth. Um, uh, Stay behind that. So when and getting in front of the medicine is where the ego, in a sense, is putting itself in front of the voice of wisdom, the unconditioned, unconditional voice of clarity and intelligence. Terence McKenna talked a lot about intelligence in his work. That
Yeah.
intelligence is our sort of birthright and can be helped perhaps by the careful, judicious use of psychedelics. So staying behind the medicine is really connected very much to this humility aspect of it, like, and letting go of control. Your need to enforce your agenda on things, right? There's an old book called "Don't Push the River; It Flows by Itself."
Mm,
Right? It's
right.
that notion that the river is what you might call the natural, intelligent flow of unconditioned energy,
Mm,
intelligence in the world. And that we're all capable of tuning into. Uh, but again, we tend to put our ideas of how things should happen and what
yeah.
we're allowing ourselves to experience and what we want, to in front of that. That's getting in front of the medicine. Staying behind the medicine is paying attention, all that kind of humbling stuff that I spoke about, all that sense of moment by moment presence that I spoke about, and allowing, it's obviously amplified in a psychedelic encounter, but it's relevant to, I think, every moment of our lives. That just stay behind, in a sense, the natural flow of intelligence, the intuitive, felt, experienced energies of life that we don't realize we can trust until we start learning to trust them, right?
Yeah.
Because we don't trust that, so we feel like we have to impose our. We don't even do this. Most people don't even do this consciously. It's just something that we grew up thinking was the way things are. Is that
Mm.
I have to have things go a certain way. When people talk about making intentions, there's a certain nuance to that sometimes where they say, state your intention and then let go of what you expect to come from that or how it unfolds. I think I saw something recently. Forget, oh yeah, it was Gary Snyder, one of the great beat poets from the 1950s and 60s. He said, if you ask, it will come to you, but not the way you thought it was going to, right?
Yeah.
So that's where this kind of sense of presence comes in, openness, like just pay attention. Intelligence, information that's of use can come from anywhere at any time. It could come over the counter of a discussion at the coffee shop. Anything can happen that could be of use to you or the other person or both of you. Anything can twig that way, and there's magic in the world. I'm absolutely convinced of it. There's intelligence throughout nature. So we can ultimately, I've got a lot more to learn about that. I'm not saying I'm a master of, seeing, reading, feeling, and acting on the intelligences that exist naturally, unconditioned intelligence, but that's my aspiration. That's my practice when I'm not fooling myself.
Mhm.
Like that. On that cheery note, I probably should go. Do you have, like, maybe if maybe time for one more quick one? If you have something you felt like, oh shit, I really wished I'd asked
I
Stephen
mean,
that.
the oh shit one is more of a any last words of wisdom for now in this call that maybe it's something that's been spurred in this talk or something that's just really alive and present for you at this time, that you'd like to share with the world. I mean, one was like, why did you write your book, and what was it about bringing all these voices together that seemed important? But if that blends into your answer here,
Yeah.
I mean, what's
Well,
true?
the low grade answer was I needed something to do, but that's kind of a glib answer. Um, the better angels, you might say, within myself would be like, I see myself as an educator, and I'm just trying to share, but I don't see myself as the ultimate authority, and that's why I didn't write the book myself. I wrote like 3 chapters or something, and there are 25 other contributors because there are a lot of voices. And the same thing at the conference. You mentioned at the beginning of this conversation that the diversity of voices. It's really important to hear from a lot of people with different perspectives on this work. The bottom line, I guess, for a summation of today's discussion is that I would like to say that um, we all are capable of waking up to our true nature. And that's very, although it sounds like a simplistic statement, almost a, little patronizing or something, uh, it's it's true because most people, I don't think, realize it, that what we're actually capable of. We don't know what we don't know in that sense. So I just encourage anyone watching or listening to this to have faith that waking up is what we are meant to do, what we are built to do as human beings. Waking up in the sense of relaxing, surrendering into our true nature as divine beings, if you will. One of the chapters in the book is called Becoming Divine, right? Becoming a divine being, like that. It's our true nature. And the turning of the soil that Belinda Ariaco mentioned is that this is, maybe I'll end here. This is essential to all this. And it's going to be tough for me to get this down to 26 words or less, but because it's actually another big topic. So maybe we have to do this again sometime, John, but if you want. But the biggest overarching issue with all of this, in my mind, and Chris Beisch talks about this, Dwayne Elgin talks about that in his chapter on the birth of a mature planetary civilization. Others talk about it, is that the spiritual disconnection from who we really are and our connectedness and our humble, in a sense, embeddedness with everything, and our actual divine nature as intelligent, compassionate, loving, creative beings, the disconnection from that, to varying degrees, but for the most part, we're living under the shadow of not knowing that about our true nature, most of us. That has reached a karmic endpoint. The current trajectory is not sustainable. It's destroying the planet, and it's got to change. And it's every one of us can participate in that. Every one of us who is capable of hearing that, being open to it, facing our fear and confusion about the breakdown of society, the collapse of the way things are. There are visions that have been around for a long time from indigenous people and from modern psychonauts like Chris Beisch, is that, that has to empty out. The old has to empty out for there to be space for the new to come in. And the new is not exactly new. It's the ancient new, like Terence, one of Terence's books is ancient, archaic revival. It's like the revival of our true nature, right? So that is, I think, the ultimately most important message, is that we can wake up, and we have to start looking at, if we haven't already, the fact that this way that the world is being run now is not functional. It's not sustainable. It's not viable. And this is why I say it's a huge topic, but how we can deal with that. But I think just to have some clarity that there is a new world possible, and it's the real world, it's the sane world, it's the sustainable world, and it's the only, in my view, it's in a sense the only thing worth prioritizing above all else, is that we are participants in this potentially. So maybe I'll just leave it there.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. StephenGray, ladies and gentlemen. Show the books 2 more times here.
Thanks.
Yeah. Anywhere that you'd like folks to find you if you'd like to be found?
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I'm on Facebook as StephenGray, all one word, Vision, separate word, StephenGray, and then Vision. And I'm on, I think I'm on Instagram by that same handle, and TikTok, and LinkedIn. My website is also called StephenGray, all one word, Vision. So that's StephenGray, not EY, and then separate word, Vision. But the website is Stephen, all one word, of course, StephenGrayVision.com. And there's contact info in various places like that. I'm on Facebook. People can try to reach me through Facebook Messenger. They can ask to be accepted on LinkedIn or any of those kind of things. So I'm not hard to find. And if people have genuine issues they want to discuss, sincere questions, comments, contributions, I'm open to all that.
Wonderful. Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your time, Stephen. I think we'll have to bookmark this for another discussion for sure, just to keep
It's
going
possible.
deeper, share the
Yeah.
message. Yeah.
We'll see what happens with this one. If it gets some attention in the world, and then it might be worth following up.
All right.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, and take good care. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Okay.
See ya. Yeah. Let me know when you have it published, and I'll share it as well.
Sounds great. Okay. Take care.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Cheers.